Now, the specifics of the story may not be important to a lot of people, but because it's so important to me and because it sort of does have a gist in the end of it all, I still suggest you listen along and pay attention because there's some things to get out of the story. Now, a couple nights ago, I had one of the most historical, nostalgic moments of my entire life. It was just amazing looking back at something that I did more than half my life ago, and looking back at it now, how much I enjoyed it and how much I can enjoy it again. And it has to do with music, and music is something that has always been a massive, well, ever since the second half of my first decade of my life, if you will. Beginning then, music became a massive part of my life. I would always listen to it. I started playing the piano, started playing the drums, started playing all the instruments, and that's when it became a big part for me. But before even then, when I lived in Russia until I was about 7 years old, my sister, who was sort of a big influence at 2 points in my life, that was one of them. She was kind of in the sort of rebellious gothic phase of her life. And I don't want to say that she was like a goth, like cutting stuff like this. No, she was just kind of trying to rebel, and she was in her teens, and that's understandable. Anyway, so I did manage to, when I was like 6, listen to some of the music she was listening to, and it was kind of like this. It was a mix of this electronic but still very like industrial metal band called Goth Minister, and back then they were a little bit more electronic. Now they've actually taken more of a straight like pop/metal type of outlook, and it's actually a very good mix because I just love their style. And anyways, back then I listened to it and I was really, really into it. But then once I moved to Canada, that's when things turned on its side, if you will, because that's when I was physically and mentally converted to the classical period of my life. And until I was about 10 years old, I listened to nothing but classical music my entire life. I lost all respect for modern music because I felt that you needed the origins of it all, the music itself that took actual skill to make, not pressing buttons on a keyboard or anything. That was my mindset. And I also played piano, and I had a strictly classical training. I still, to this day, I can listen to it, but I don't understand, and I cannot play jazz. That's just something that I've been lacking in my musical training. But I was strictly 100% classical, and that's all that I listened to. And finally, around 10 years old, I managed to get my hands on Rock Band, and that's when, for the first time, with the help of myself, changing my mindset a little bit, and the help of my sister again, that was like her second time that she really stepped into my life when it comes to music. I got back into metal. It started off slow. I started listening to Metallica, and that was kind of like the basis of it all. That was thrash. That was sort of what the very origins of metal evolved into. Metal became a really dirty word in late 70s, early 80s, but those were the bands, Metallica and all their friends, I guess, if you will. They were the underground, and they're the ones that really brought metal back to its fame, I guess, if you will. It's still not mainstream, and that's unfortunate, but I guess that's the way I like it because I hate being a mainstream person. They brought metal back into popularity, and I still to this day believe that Metallica is the most successful heavy metal band in the history of the world, and that will stay with me forever. That is another root that I will never forget. But it started evolving. As I was growing up. I'm now in my later teens. As I was growing up, I started to develop more of a requirement for more complex music because I was still taking piano. I still had the classical on one end of the scale, and I had metal like Metallica, Megadeth, Iron Maiden a little bit in there. I had stuff like this on the other half. And then I started building a requirement for more complex music, and with the Rock Band 2, the massive journey, I guess, for me musically started, because Rock Band 2 I played all the way to the end until I got to the second hardest song in the game called Panic Attack by Dream Theater. And that's when I discovered a universe that I never knew existed, progressive metal. it was just the greatest discovery of my life that I made absolutely by myself, because it opened these doors to a whole different genre of metal. And I mean, comparing it to Metallica, you can see the influences, but the music itself is so just terribly different, and I love it. And to this day, Dream Theater is my favorite band because of their style and their music, and all their influences and things like this. Different progressive metal bands, Symphony X, for example, things like this. They're still on my list of very frequently listened music, because that's the combination of the two. That's the combination of just pure raw metal, what Metallica and everything was, and the combination of classical, because what progressive metal is it's progressing the sound. It's rebelling against the rules of classical by putting distortion on everything, but it's rebelling against the rules of metal by twisting up the time signatures, adding in instruments that you wouldn't hear normally in metal, and things like this. And because of Dream Theater, and because I actually I started listening to Dream Theater so much, I am kind of a person that doesn't like to do the same thing repeatedly. That's why I got into Dream Theater in the first place, and that's why I still love their music, because you cannot get bored of it by listening to it enough. And that's what happened to me. I started listening to it too much, and so I felt like, even though I still listen to it very frequently, I started to take steps back down the progressive ladder, if you will. And I got back into some heavier metal bands like Gojira. Gojira is still progressive, but they're very, very heavy and raw. And I went to their concert, and I loved them very much, indeed. But thanks to them, I also discovered a man by the name of Devin Townsend. And his story is very interesting because it's so long. And over his lifetime, he's developed so many different writing styles. And that's when I discovered the Devin Townsend Project, because they were doing like a 30-minute show before the Gojira show. And I got into that, and I got my hands on all 4 of the Project albums, and I realized that it was the same guy making completely different genres. I mean, he had one album that was just completely progressive. It made no sense. It would make no sense to anyone who's not into metal. If you try to get someone into heavier music when they're big pop fans, some of his music is just the absolute worst decisions you could ever make in your lifetime to try and get people to like him. On the other hand, he had albums that were more pop-like. He had more albums that were more country-like. Like, some of his songs, you could put them under relaxational for some of the music he's done. And I started listening to him a couple months ago a lot. And that's why a couple nights ago, because I got my little wheels in my brain thinking, I remembered I really took a look down in the depths of the progressive ladder, the very bottom of it. And I remembered, yeah, this band called Goth Minister, that's all I ever listened to, and I was like 6. And I went back to them last night, and I just had the greatest of times just listening. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. It's compared to things like Dream Theater and the heavier Devin Townsend works in Gojira, this is pop 100% to the max. I mean, it's a consistent 4/4 time signature, and it's just really vocal based. There's no weird song structures. It's just like verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. That's like the way they set up their songs, and that's why all of them average about 4.5 minutes max. And I went back to that, and and because I missed so much of their existence, I actually realized how much in themselves they've developed. And especially some of their singles from the very late 2000s, and now they have a new album that came out this year that I'm aware of. I realized how much they've developed, and I really, really love them again. I just had the second greatest discovery I've ever made in my life. It was kind of a rediscovery, if you will, and I just can't stop listening to them now. It's like I have it's like I've begun to fill that massive gap between heavy, very messed up progressive metal and very I don't even know. I was gonna make a reference to blunt and just simple metal like thrash was back in the 80s, and then I thought, well, there's also the classical music, but that's also really complex in its way, but it's just the origins of everything. That's where everything started from. And so now I feel like, thinking of origins in themselves, it's kind of like you had classical, and then it branched off like a tree into many different sides. And I feel like now I'm taking a little bit of a trip down the little branches of that tree to get myself to like more genres of music. Now, I forgot to mention the fact that as my little metal phase was kicking in, that's when I started doing all those sports and things like this, and I started taking road trips with my dad. And whenever we're in the car, we'd always listen to the Beatles, and he really got me into that sort of music. I mean, it's I understand why they're dubbed the greatest rock band of all time, and I understand, but that's just not the music that I would prefer to listen to for 24 hours straight. But you know, it's there, and I appreciate them. And so now that I'm taking this ride down the branches of the trees, I kind of got my mind thinking this morning and this afternoon. Well, why don't we appreciate our origins and our roots a little more? It's kind of weird how we sort of forget, and how we need those times where we look back and we think about it to appreciate where we came from and who we are. We have over 7 billion people in the world, and whatever makes them different from them is our present. But the thing is, our present wouldn't be the same if it wasn't for our past, and so we could look at that and we could think, what made us different from everyone, and what should we appreciate about ourselves? If you're looking for an idea of how to be different from people, that's where you should look. I mean, a person like me would hate massively being like others. I hate this as a fact. I want myself to be a little bit more memorable than others because I want to stand out. It's the most blunt and useless thing in the world to be just like everybody else. And I feel like the reason I want to be different, the reason I am different, is because of my roots and where everything and my origins and where my entire life started, I guess, in its way, and why I've developed into the person I am. That's because of what happened in my childhood, what happened in my early teens. And I've really started, today I look back and I really had a good thought at why I am the person I am today. Now, the reason this music thing ties in is because that's the thing that sparked the idea. But this whole gist of it all could be taken in many, many different directions. You could think about this musically. You could think about this with sports. If you've been doing sports for a really long time and you've dropped some and you've been starting some, look back at why you started the very first sport. Look back at why you started the very first sport you ever did. And think about why you're doing sports now. Think about why you entered the school you did. Maybe because you were forced to, maybe because you had a choice. And think about what you're doing now. Think about the things you wanted to be when you were little, and think about the things you want to be now. And it's really interesting. I don't know if other people like this, but I myself, I love to take giant strolls, giant trips with this train of thought just goes on in my head. And that's what I've been thinking about almost all day. And that's what I've been remembering. And it's a great thing to be able to remember your past. And I think it's a thing that's very underrated in everyday people. I mean, looking at people that right now have an everyday office job and they do exactly the same routine every day, and they go back to their families in the evening and they have dinner and they have the same process over and over again. And you feel the same. You feel just like everybody else that's in the same loop as you are. And if you're one of those people, which I really doubt you're watching this video, if you are, if you feel like this, if you feel like you're stuck in this routine that everyone else is doing with you, look at what makes you different as a person. Look what separates you from society, and you'll find that answer in your roots, where you came from. And that for me is, my roots and my origins are what separate me from people drastically, because especially in places where I live, like Canada, in Canada, you'll very rarely find a person who was born in Tuapse, who moved to Moscow, and then at the age of 7 moved to more south of where he is in Ontario now, and then moved again, and now is at this school. You won't find this person anywhere. 7.5, I think, billion people in the world. You won't find another person like me with my story. And that's what I feel I appreciate most about myself, the fact that I am so different from everyone. And I don't know if other people look at that positively or negatively, and mostly so far in my life I got negative responses to that, but I'm fine. And I feel like once I encounter enough people, maybe I'll find people that are like myself and that I can spend more time with. But at least for now, all I have is myself and my trains of thoughts, and that's what I'm going to keep doing, and thinking about why I am here and why I'm not somewhere else. And as a little final thought, take a look at your history and take a look at one of the events and erase it. Imagine where you would be if that one event didn't happen. I mean, it's like going back in time, altering something, and now just the entire existence of the world as it is today being erased, and a whole new world being created because one tiny thing didn't happen, and it's possible. And if something didn't happen back home in Russia, I would still be living there today. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be making videos in the first place, which is a very small and very insignificant thing to compared to everything else I've done. But I wouldn't have been doing any of that. And I wonder, and I wonder, and I wonder, and that's all I have to say. And so look back at your history, look back at where you came from, and appreciate that you're different from everyone, and believe that that's how it should be, because it should. Because if we lived in a blunt, similar universe, in a sort of utopia where everything was perfect, and we did the same thing every day, and everyone got along, and we didn't have any conflicts at all, I would suicide. Really, I cannot imagine living in a world where everything is the same, which is unfortunate, but that's the way it is. So, with that little bittersweet ending, I think I would call it quits for this little podcast, and hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully I got you thinking a little bit. So yeah, see you guys later, and goodbye.